All right, so today we're going to be discussing amazing architectural finds that have been discovered in the Sahara Desert. We're also going to talk about how they found this place called Richet Pratt that many believe is the true location of Atlantis. Now, I personally, from my own research, I believe that the Atlanteans were worldwide. They were seafarers, they were very advanced, and I believe they had many locations. But I think the key to finding the locations that they were in are in these concentrical rings, okay? So we're going to talk about that, and we're also going to talk about why it's no longer here. Because I believe that our binary star system hypothesis is how we can explain why places like the Sahara Desert or places in Göbekli Tepe in Turkey and several other locations have these wonderful structures that have been buried and desolate for many, many thousands of years. Even the Sphinx. Okay, so we're going to get right into it, and we're going to listen to what this man has to say. This is a video from the Bright Side, and he's very good in his research.
There is a bizarre place in the remote Western Sahara Desert called the Richat Structure. And if you've never seen or heard of this place before, you are in for something truly fascinating. Some people refer to it as the Eye of the Sahara or the Eye of Africa, and when you see it from space, it's not hard to understand why. I mean, it really does look like an eye. And people are absolutely stunned when they see it for the first time. Between its unusual symmetrical shape, color, and immense size, it takes many people by curious surprise as they wonder not only what this thing is, but how did they go their whole life without seeing or hearing about it before? However, the fascination of this place goes far beyond its intriguing shape and design. 2 years ago, I made 3 videos where I shared more than a dozen remarkable similarities between this structure to that of Plato's description of the legendary lost ancient city of Atlantis. And these similarities are so astounding that the topic of Atlantis and the Richat structure quickly became one of the most discussed and hotly debated topics involving lost ancient human civilizations, as tabloid news outlets from around the world picked up on the story, and the videos ignited thought-provoking conversation as to whether or not it's possible that the lost city of Atlantis actually existed, and if so, had it been hiding in plain sight in the remote, desolate Mauritanian desert of Africa for thousands of years. But even for most people, when they hear the words Lost City of Atlantis, most would usually think of some animated Disney movie about a fictional underwater city, or perhaps some beach resort in the Bahamas. However, a little known fact is that the true origins of the tale of Atlantis originates from the ancient Egyptians, as they had carved in stone that there were survivors of Atlantis, which were said to be a sophisticated civilization that existed some 12,000 years ago.
I just want to pause this for a moment so that we can take a look at this map a little more clearly. So you have the outer harbor, okay? And then you have this outer island, outer ring island with docks and towers and guardhouses and all of that kind of stuff. Then you have the middle harbor. Then you have the inner ring island, and this is where the fountains and the hot springs and the cold springs and the baths and all of those things are found. Then we have an inner harbor, and in the center is the central island, which is 5 states wide, and the temple of Poseidon. Now, you also have a bridge that leads you all the way out across all of the waters, but you see the ships travel on the outer ring. Now, he's getting ready to explain to you, and up here is the canal to the sea. He's going to explain to you just exactly how it could have been possible for the Eye of the Sahara to have actually been Atlantis and this waterway once upon a time.
That was until their island was obliterated by a cataclysm, and the survivors of Atlantis found their way to the Nile Delta region to start all over again as colonizers. And I'll be retouching on many of those similarities again in this video, as incredible new information has come to light, and it is now time to revisit this topic again. You see, the interest in the Eye of the Sahara is not just limited to us here chatting about it over the internet, because it turns out that the CIA has also had quite an interest in this place as well.
That's right.
And it goes back decades. So get this. There are declassified CIA documents on the Richat structure, the Eye of the Sahara. That's right, and I've seen the release files with my own eyes, and I'm going to share them with you here as well. And I have to say that this stuff is beyond interesting. However, let me just say that there's nothing in these declassified files that say anything about Atlantis or lost ancient civilizations. What they do say is quite interesting. However, what these files do not say, the parts that are redacted and still classified, is really going to get you thinking. So where do I begin? Well, it turns out in 1967, the CIA conducted a secret mission where they sent military aircraft to conduct covert surveillance and scientific experiments on about a dozen different sites from around the world to study for geomagnetic anomalies. And of the few places in the world that they chose to study on this top secret mission, the mysterious Eye of the Sahara just so happened to be one of them. And like I said, the stated purpose of studying these sites was for identifying geomagnetic anomalies, which, if you're not familiar, the Earth's geomagnetic field is what shields us from the vastness of space, which, when you think about it, is incredible. I mean, it allows our planet to travel through the cosmos at incredible speeds, all while protected from the vacuum of space as we live comfortably and safely within a seemingly invisible shield that's in the shape of a bubble. So
Now, I want to also point out here that this is also where the classification from the CIA of the Adam and Eve story comes into play. This is all connected. Every bit of it is connected. Now, I have this book, but as you can see, it's a very thin book. There have been 281 pages removed and redacted by the CIA for this book. The author, Chan Thomas, did some work where he researched and studied, much like I have, on Einstein's theories about magnetic pole reversals, as well as Charles Hapgood's research on the crustal displacement theory and how pole shifts happen on a routine cyclical basis and why this might be. Okay? Now, the fact that we have a pole reversal in and of itself is not something that needs to be classified or that would be considered information that you wouldn't necessarily want the public at large to know. The actual purpose for classifying it, in my opinion, would be the connection to a binary star system. Okay, and we'll get into that a little later. And also, I love that he put the picture up of Mars next to Earth, because now there is finally research that I did 20 years ago is finally surfacing in the past week, talking about how Dr. Brandenburg, who was a physicist for the military, actually discovered from the Mars rover samples that they brought back from Mars that it has this very high level of radiation, suggesting nuclear war or nuclear fallout of some sort on a large scale, which also plays into this, but we'll get to that at a later time. Right now, I want to focus on the Sahara and Atlantis and where all that comes from. Okay, so like I said, we'll get into that later. But this Adam and Eve story, even though it has very few pages left for the public to actually be able to read, it's still worth the read because it actually helps to understand fully where we're going, why this matters to us. Okay?
This secret mission is declassified. What were the results of that mission and the scientific experiments? Well, we don't know, because that part is still classified, as there is nothing in these release files that say anything about what the findings of their scientific study were related to geomagnetic anomalies or their covert surveillance, which is utterly weird when you consider that this was back in 1967, 54 years ago from 2021, and we still...
Which, interestingly enough, is when Charles Hapgood worked for the CIA and was doing this research and published his paper about crustal displacement and a pole shift and what he thinks caused it. Which is what led Chan Thomas to writing the story of Adam and Eve, the true Adam and Eve story.
Still don't get to know what the results of their findings were? So, yeah, is it just me, or is that strangely interesting? But here's the thing. That is just the beginning of where things start to get weird. In fact, that is probably the least interesting part of these declassified files. Now, before I share that next part, I must first revisit a few of the remarkable similarities between the Eye of the Sahara to that of the tale of Atlantis, so that way we can all truly appreciate just how interesting / bizarre all of this actually is. As I discussed in my previous videos, the story of Atlantis originates from the ancient Egyptians, and they described an empire named Atlantis, which consisted of 10 kingdoms, and the capital of Atlantis was on an island that consisted of 3 rings of water and 2 of land, which, of course, when we look at the Richat structure, you see that it would precisely match that specific detail of 3 rings of water and 2 of land. And not only that, it was said to open to the sea at the south, which is exactly what you see here at the Richat. In fact, you can literally see the striations in the sand where water once flowed through it. But not only that, those white blemishes are indeed salt. An unbelievably significant detail, which I'll discuss more of in a moment. But Atlantis was also said to have mountains to the north, mountains that were said to have rivers run through them, which, yes, there are mountains with evidence of ancient water flow north of the Richat. Atlantis was also said to be surrounded by a large plain, which also exists for hundreds of miles on both sides of the Richat structure. Another striking similarity is that Atlantis was said to consist of black, red, and white colored stone, which is incredibly interesting when you see all the stones of that color in and around the region of the Richat. There was also said to be an abundance of elephants, and elephants live in Mauritania today and have for thousands of years. In fact, there's an even ancient cave art depicting elephants not far from the Richat. And Atlantis was also said to have an abundance of exotic fruit and vegetables, which makes the case for it being in North Africa even more compelling, considering that we now know that the Sahara Desert didn't even exist until somewhere around 11,600 years ago, where it went from green to desert in practically an instant. But many people...
And that's also important to take note of, right? The time frame they're talking about, around 11,600 years ago, because that actually fits the math for a binary star system and how often it comes around and how often our planet experiences a pole shift, a magnetic pole shift.
People are not aware of this incredible fact that the Sahara had previously been a lush green tropical paradise at the same time that Atlantis was said to exist. In fact, it was said to be made up of the largest freshwater lakes and rivers ever known to exist anywhere on Earth, which of course would support that the region of the Western Sahara would have naturally growing fruits and vegetables. But alleged vegetation that no longer exists in this region aside, Atlantis was said to have an abundance of metals, including iron, copper, and gold. Well, it turns out that Mauritania's most common exports today include iron, copper, and gold. But the similarities do not end here. You see, Atlantis was said to be created by the god Poseidon, and Poseidon had 10 children that came from 5 sets of male twins. And each of these 10 children would individually be ruler of the 10 kingdoms that made up the empire of Atlantis. And the firstborn would rule the capital, and his name was Atlas. So does anyone want to guess who the name of the first king of Mauritania was? King Atlas, who ruled over the Maori people, which is why the land is called Mauritania today. And not only that, the vast mountain region located north of the Richat just so happens to be named the Atlas Mountains. What a coincidence. Now, another incredible detail involves this map. Herodotus is considered by many to be the father of history due to his extensive historical documentation. In fact, we wouldn't even know about the Greco-Persian Wars if it wasn't for him. And some 2,500 years ago, he made a written, detailed account of the known world at that time. However, he himself did not draw out this map.
This is also important.
Others, and I do not know who or when, read through his various works and annotated that the people of Atlantis lived in this region you see here, which just so happens to be the same general location of the Richat structure. What are the odds of that? The very same place that has a highly unusual land feature that consists of symmetrical rings. Now, the similarities do not even end here. Go watch my 3 other videos on this topic, because for the sake of brevity in this video, I want to share new information that has come to light. But just to sum up where we're at so far, the most striking comparisons include that the Richat would have 3 rings of water and 2 of land, an opening to the sea at the south, mountains to the north with evidence of water erosion, black, red, and white colored stones, an abundance of iron, copper, and gold, a vast plain surrounding on both sides. Elephants existed in this area, and not only that, evidence of profound amounts of vegetation existing at the same place and at the same time of when Atlantis was said to exist. Now, these similarities are pretty remarkable. However, that does not necessarily prove that this is the long-lost location of Atlantis. In fact, there are many different counter-arguments on why this cannot be the site, which I'll be discussing in detail later in the video. But let me first circle back to the declassified files on the Eye of the Sahara. Like I mentioned, these files do not say anything about Atlantis or lost ancient civilizations, nor do they include the very results of the scientific study for geomagnetic anomalies. Which is so weird considering, again, it's 54 years later, and we're still not allowed to know, because here's what I consider to be the weirdest part of all, which involves the entire context of this study itself. Quote, while the scientific aspects of this survey are totally unclassified and available to the worldwide scientific community, blank, redacted, not unclassified, as in still classified 54 years later in 2021. Let me read that again. While the scientific aspects of this survey are totally unclassified and available to the worldwide scientific community, nothing. What did the rest of this half page that is now whited out, redacted, and even which continues on to a small portion on the next page, what did all of this say? It's quite literally the entire context of the mission itself, and yet it's still classified. They purposely removed it decades later. So ask yourself, 1, why did they end up not including the results of their findings within the released declassified files, despite the fact that they said that they would? 2, why did they classify the mission itself when they had also first said that it wasn't going to be? And 3, why is this giant portion redacted from the declassified files themselves? Like I said at the beginning of this video, that is strangely interesting, isn't it? But let me be clear, I am not suggesting that these files had anything to do with Atlantis. But at the same time, I do find it interesting in that Atlantis was said to have special geologic properties to it. For example, the center island of the capital was said to have 2 springs of fresh water, one of cold, the other warm. And that in itself would be geologically unique. So the fact that there was something about this site that led to a top secret study for geomagnetic properties makes me wonder, particularly when you realize that most of it is still classified in so many decades later. And especially when you consider that this site just so happens to have so many uncanny similarities to the description of Atlantis as I just shared. But with all of that said, do you guys want to hear some new information that I've learned that makes this location even more compelling? So, despite the striking similarities at the wrist shot in comparison to Atlantis, many people still have doubts that the eye could even possibly be the location, as the structure today is more than 1,200 feet above sea level. So, how could this place be the location of an island that once met the ocean? Well, notice the various areas of white coloration that you see not only from the air, but from satellite imagery as well. These white blemishes are indeed salt. You can even go there and taste it right off the ground yourself.
Loads of salt.
My journalist friend Josh Sigurdsson did, and what an insanely epic trip he had to this site. In fact, he almost died, and I encourage all of you to go and watch his video on BitChute. But something many people do not know is that this region has an abundance of salt at surface level. In fact, you can read articles about the salt caravans that exist in Mauritania today. This is something that is widely documented yet little known. This salt came from the ocean, and you can literally see it in the exact areas where cataclysmic flooding once flowed through here, as you can see from satellite imagery. And even the areas of the lowest elevation within the wrist shots are the areas with the most salt, making it even more evident that salt water once consumed and settled within this structure. And you'll also see it noticeably at the southern entrance, respectively. It's worth noting that the highly respected Randall Carlson himself has analyzed this site and stated that it is a location of cataclysmic water erosion.
Randall Carlson
He actually
is
went into
another one to
detail about
listen
this
to.
on his own YouTube channel, and I highly recommend you check it out. And I'll leave a link in the description down below. But let me play a couple short clips so you can hear it directly from him.
And in fact, I'll show you in a minute, it looks like there was evidence for extreme floods over this whole landscape. You can see incised by erosion. This is obviously water erosion here.
And he goes on to make the comparison of the massive recessional cataracts found at Dry Falls in Washington state, which were caused by cataclysmic flooding at the end of the last ice age. Well, it turns out that the Rishad itself has the same type of water erosion as well, as he points out here.
Which is very interesting. You see what actually looks like recessional cataracts.
Yeah.
So the stripping and exposure of this feature may have involved catastrophism.
Now, hold on to that thought, because he goes on to point out that you can even see the landmark water ripples created from immense levels of water flow all around the Rishad, which matches the landmark ripples observed in the northwestern United States in the same exact region as the Dry Falls recessional cataracts as I just shared.
Do you see?
The pictures you see here are at the Missoula floodplains in Washington state and Montana, which Randall Carlson was discussing. And those massive ripples are hundreds of feet wide and can only be appreciated from the air as they are that big, which further illustrates the level of cataclysmic flooding this area once endured some 12,000 years ago. And real quick, just for frame of reference, compare the small ripples we've all seen at the beach. And in fact, just the other day, I had a great synchronicity while I was walking my dog along a canal and noticed the same small sand ripples at the bottom. So now listen to what Mr. Carlson shares with us about the Rishad.
Look right here. You see the current ripples? Now there's sand between them, but if these are similar to the current giant current ripples we see out in Washington and Montana, and notice the texture here, passing over the reef out to sea, right here. And if we zoom in,
Okay.
yeah, so this is southwest of the actual structure. So what it appears to me is sometimes you had tremendous processes at work here. Oh yeah, look at this, a beautiful. There it is.
Wow, there it is. Wow.
Yeah.
Intense.
Now, something that Randall makes no mention of is the existing salt found all around this area, including the images he shares on screen, as you can observe throughout this image in the area, all those white blemishes. We can even reference the nearby Tashit, Mauritania salt caravans I shared a few moments ago. All of those white blemishes are surface level salt, and I'd be very curious to hear what Randall Carlson's thoughts are on this important detail. Again, this is how you know the Rishad was consumed by the ocean within the last 12,000 years by some unknown cataclysmic flooding event, because let's not forget that the latest scientific studies have proven that the Sahara Desert was a lush green tropical paradise up until around 11,600 or so years ago, which is when it started to become the vast desert we all know today. And the sands of the Sahara are known to have come from the ocean after this transition to the desert happened, and the fact that the sand has salt on top of it is how you know that the ocean flooded over this region far more recently than most realize. You see, most have assumed that the last time North Africa was under the ocean was between 50 and 66 million years ago. And that was the time of the Trans-Saharan Seaway. But notice that this seaway does not annotate it going over the area of the Richat structure. Rather, it goes south. Yet, clearly, the same landmark evidence of cataclysmic flooding did flow over the Richat, which is evidence, and also confirmed by experts such as Carlson himself.
And as well, Charles Hapgood and many other greats. Now, we're going to bump forward through this a bit.
Massive flooding stripped away the bedrock itself. That means that everything that would have been built above it would have been swept away along with that bedrock that once sat on top of. So here's a short clip of Mr. Carlson addressing this.
It does appear that there were extreme floods and fluvial erosion over the plateau that would have been ultimately responsible for exposing the core of this unique structure that would have been buried beneath, many hundreds of feet, maybe thousands of feet of bedrock at one time.
Clearly, if flooding occurred that was strong enough to strip bedrock, you're not going to remove the bedrock without removing everything else that was on top of it. It's the same concept of the so-called tablecloth trick, except that that trick obviously wouldn't work in a case of catastrophic flooding. So if we're talking about removing...
However, we actually have new discoveries that we're going to get into very soon, where some of these structures, I want you to look at this picture very well, okay? Some of these structures have actually been uncovered recently. And that's what we're going to get into now. Because that's the really, for me, the really exciting part of
the topic
this
of the lost
discovery.
ancient city of Atlantis,
So again,
and
we
the Eye
have
of the Sahara,
the
which
bright side.
in just the last few years has taken the internet by storm as this unbelievably bizarre
Learning about this.
structure just so happens to match
actually the
a
bright
dozen
insight.
of the
My
most
bad.
significant similarities to Plato's description of the famed lost capital city of Atlantis. But perhaps the only thing stranger than these striking comparisons is the fact that the Richat structure itself remains a genuine scientific mystery that continues to confound.
And learning about all of this is actually very important for us to understand not only where we came from and what happened in our true history, our true past, but actually what's coming in our future.
Only makes its distinctive nature that much more curious when you consider that so few people have still never seen or heard of it before, even including the most curious and inquisitive minds around.
But let me ask you this, Joe, real quick. When you saw my video, was that the very first time you had ever seen this thing before?
Yeah.
That's the thing.
And that is the thing, because if nothing else, this extraordinarily unique anomaly should be included on the list of natural wonders of the world. But nevertheless, when you see the new lines of evidence that I'm going to share in this video, it will become exceedingly apparent that the fittingly named Eye of the Sahara is by far the most likely location for the lost capital city of Atlantis. And not only that, these new details will likely make those who previously thought that this site could not possibly be the location of Atlantis think again. So with all of that said, let me start off by sharing something particularly interesting. It is widely known that the ancient Romans were renowned for documenting everything, as the Caesars went to profound extent to accumulate knowledge and information from every location their vast empire ventured. So I have to admit that I was quite surprised to learn of someone by the name of Pomponius Mela, who was the Romans' first geographer dating back to some 2,000 years ago, and had created a sophisticated map of the known world at that time, titled the habitable world of Pomponius Mea, something that up until recently I had never seen or heard of before. And real quick, let's not confuse this map with the ancient Greek historian Herodotus' map of the known world of 2,500 years ago, which I shared in one of my prior videos on this topic. A map that curiously listed Atlantes in the same location of the Rishot. However, the original source of this map is a bit of a mystery, as modern historians
it's
claim
even
that
called
Herodotus
Atlantis.
is not known to have ever created an actual
See?
map, and have thus put its origins into question. So, putting that map aside, let's focus on this verifiably authentic 2,000-year-old map that has also annotated something very interesting in the Western Sahara Desert. First, notice that this map is oriented to the east in its original form, so let me go ahead and flip it to a north-south facing orientation so we can gain our bearing. And the features of Europe, West Asia, and North Africa become apparent. So let's now focus our attention to what is in the northwest region of the Sahara,
Africa.
and observe what it annotates here.
Check this out.
Atlantia, or Atlantiae, which more or less appears as Atlanteans, and again, in the same geographical region of the Rishot structure, which, like I've shared in my prior videos, just so happens to coincidentally match so many precise details that Plato described of Atlantis, including that the capital city was famously said to be made up of concentric circles, specifically 3 rings of water and 2 of land, which correctly matches the Rishot with water in it, which it certainly did, as I will prove to you with hard scientific data in just a moment. But the circular ring city was also said to have an opening to the sea at the south, which not only matches the southerly opening of the Rishot anomaly, but it even has existing evidence of a flow of salt water that is still visible to this day, which, and again, I will prove with hard scientific evidence shortly. But Atlantis was also said to be surrounded by a large rectangular plain.
Pause.
All right, so we're going to bump ahead to this one where they've actually found things that were lost and buried underneath of the Sahara sands.
Because it turns out that the most recent scientific evidence shows that the Saharan desert is far younger than we ever thought. In fact, what scientists assumed was millions of years old, we now know that as recently as just 5,000 years ago, the Sahara Desert was a lush green tropical paradise that spanned from Egypt to the Atlantic coast of the Western Sahara and contained the world's largest freshwater lakes ever known to have existed, and not only
Ancient
that,
mega lake
a
discovered
massive
beneath
network
the
of rivers
Sahara
that made
Desert.
this entire region an oasis
An
for
ancient
ancient
river
human
network
civilization.
discovered
Thus
buried
explaining
under the
why in
Saharan
just the
sand.
last few years we've been finding so many mysteriously unknown structures.
Lost civilizations discovered in Sahara Desert. See, this is a formidable place that most people don't go to for doing any kind of archaeological discoveries or anything, because it's so vast and desolate. You know, there's no water, there's no reprieve from the sun, there's no nothing. So a lot of people don't go here. But in recent years, we now have the technology where we can actually fly over and use LiDAR to detect things, and they've discovered some incredible stuff.
In what is now a remote, barren wasteland. And listen to this. Scientists that analyzed this recent data concluded that in as little as just 100 years, the lush green tropical paradise that spanned thousands of miles across North Africa was mysteriously wiped out and transformed into what is now the world's largest hot desert. Think about that. In as little as 100 years, 1 century? In other words, something unbelievably radical happened here on Earth in the not-so-distant past to cause a complete swing in climate throughout such an enormous region and so quickly. Although I must say that estimates do
Very
vary,
abrupt.
with some scientists saying that it was more likely to be over the course of 5 centuries rather than 1 century, but either way, we are talking about an unbelievably short period of time. So the big question becomes, why did this happen? Well, scientists from MIT believe that this shift in climate is related to a 20,000-year cycle and changes to the Earth's orbital tilt, thus causing most of the Sahara to go back and forth from a desert to a jungle.
That's important to take note of and to listen to when they're doing these studies and these findings. this has a lot to do with Earth's tilt, which we know about through ice core samples, tree ring samples, etc.
Over and over again, with the last shift occurring somewhere around 5,000 years ago. Now, keep in mind that estimates vary on this as well, with some specifically stating 5,000 years ago, others stating 6,000 years ago, and there's even more broad estimates stating between 4,500 and 8,000 years ago, with others even stating dates as far back as 10,000 and 11,000 years ago, which, to me, just goes to show how little we, including scientists, actually know. Much of what we have are guesses. But I do find the estimates of 11,000 years ago to be quite interesting, as it just so happens to be very close to the Younger Dryas climate catastrophe that was right in that time frame.
11,600.
I can't help but wonder
It's
if
almost
this is
perfect
related in some way.
with a binary star system.
And you know, that reminds me, does this give any credence to the declassified documents that I discussed in a recent video, where it was stated that the Earth's poles rapidly shift and are followed by an immediate reversal every 6,500 years? I mean, really, why on earth was the CIA discussing this book in a meeting, and why did they classify the notes from that meeting? Now, whether or not the information discussed in those documents is true, whatever it was that happened on Earth in that period of time to rapidly turn the Sahara into a massive desert from what was a lush tropical environment, well, there's no doubt that the abrupt changes would have meant disaster to wildlife, vegetation, and of course, the civilizations that occupied the Sahara at that time. And when we consider the Sahara Desert's geographical location to Egypt, or should I say, the fact that Egypt is within the Sahara Desert, and combining the fact that the land of ancient Egypt is, without a doubt, the largest concentration of ancient ruins and artifacts found anywhere on Earth, and that it just so happens to date back to the same period of time as when the Sahara was green. For example, it has long been said that...
So it stands to reason that the original Egyptians were Atlanteans. Also because the Sphinx itself dates back to approximately 11,600 years ago being built. They know now that the Sphinx has water erosion around it. How in the world would it have had water erosion around the base of it, midway up, unless they experienced a great flood similar to Noah's flood?
Egypt's first dynasty dates back to just over 5,000 years ago. And the alleged first Egyptian pyramid is estimated to have been constructed around that time as well, or at least within the time frame of when the Sahara was said to be green. So hold that thought and consider the awkward fact that I've mentioned in numerous past videos, which is that the Great Sphinx of Giza has massive amounts of rainwater erosion within its enclosure. And I say awkward because the experts have always claimed that the Sphinx must be around 4,500 years old. Yet recent geological analysis implies that this cannot be the case, as the last time the Nile Delta region had significant rainfall was more than 7,000 years ago, right in the time frame of when the Sahara was green and had 10 times the rainfall that it does today. And
I'm just going to pause that for a second to reiterate to you that I still fully believe that the way that they moved these mega structures into place was through some type of vibration technology, some type of sound levitating technology that was almost like a liquefaction, the way that the earthquakes will work. When an earthquake happens, the ground shakes so violently that in areas the water can come up to the surface from underneath. I think that they had some type of technology that allowed for this great stuff to be built.
in other words, the scientific data overwhelmingly suggests that the Sphinx is at least double the age of what we were taught in school, which of course only further adds to the mystery of ancient Egypt itself. But think about what all of this means. The ancient ruins and relics that have been found from the Egyptians is concentrated largely around the Nile River. And this makes total sense, as civilizations exist where there's water. So combine that with the time frame estimates of when the Sahara went from a lush green tropical paradise to a massive barren desert several thousand years ago, well, there's obviously a connection here. And going back to what I just pointed out regarding the ancient Egyptians developing their civilization along the Nile River, and while taking into account...
I want to just pause right here real quick too, so that you can look at this map for a moment, because I don't think it's on this particular map, but the one we looked at earlier had a place called St. Louis, and this map has Memphis, and there are many other places. Palmyra is an Egyptian word, and we have a Palmyra, Indiana. A lot of these places, this is what leads me to believe that the Atlanteans were worldwide travelers. They were worldwide seafarers who could go to all of the continents, and they had places in all of those continents. Why else would you find these names in so many different places around the world that are the very same? They're not, it's not even a similarity. They are exactly the same. And then, of course, you know, we get into the Grand Canyon, and they discovered what appeared to be pre-Egyptian artifacts within the Grand Canyon as well, that many people are trying to link to the Atlanteans, and I think there's good reason for that. Now, number one, an importance of this is to understand that the Atlanteans were real. They did exist. They were human, right? They were people just like us. They were an advanced technological race of human. We, current modern day, are advancing, learning in almost lightning speed how to use technologies, right? The new iPhone, the new whatever pops out, and boom, in 6 months or a year, you've got a new device, right? All of the programming systems for the computers are always being upgraded. AI